Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, and trying to bring about different perspectives on a whole wide range of issues. And I'm very excited to have my guest today. She is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and an author of a book that I just finished that I really like called Awake, Not Awoke. Noelle Mering. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to talk to you. It's fun to read a book and then have access to the author right now, just to kind of process it. We process it in a book group, but to have the actual writer here is very, very cool.
You probably remember it better than I do, so it's really impressive.
I literally just finished it this morning, so I was trying to I was like, oh, I got to finish it before I have my conversation with her. So on this podcast, I dove into starting it in 2018, 2019. And it was right when kind of the woke stuff started to blow up. And in education, it's a very mainstream thing is thinking this way. I've had several National Teachers of the Year on who are very, very woke and things like that. And I had guests on like Travis Brown, who does the woke revolution. I've had James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian. These are people who are atheists and they're strongly against wokeness. And, Sam Harris is similar, John Haidt, people like that. And I was like, what is that? And they recognize that the things that they don't like about organized religion or, belief in God or whatever is the dogmatism, is that element of it. And that's why they're attacking wokeness. So I've had their perspective. I've had people on who are from that perspective. I also had a guest named Kimi Katiti. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She's great. She is an immigrant here. She's, a dark-skinned girl from Uganda who came here, went to university, and was told all of this woke stuff. And she was just feeling all these microaggressions and everything around her all the time, and was really feeling burdensome. She was having anxiety attacks and stuff, and then leaned into her Bible, and Christianity is the thing that got her out. And that was like, oh, that's interesting. And then your book came along, was brought to my attention. I was like, that hits the nail right on the head. That was exactly the bullseye that I'm kind of piecing together. So I'm stoked to have you on here to discuss it, Noelle. This is awesome. How did you come about writing this book? How did this get on your radar, considering your background and stuff like that? And then what made you decide okay, I'm gonna throw my hat into the ring, so to speak, and write this book?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think it was a series of kind of a combination of my personality traits and then also a series of life experiences. So I had a really intellectual father. I still do, actually, but he's an attorney, but a philosopher by hobby. And so I just grew up with him engaging me in conversations, and he gave more merit to my opinion than it warranted. So yeah. I think I just established something in me that thought that I can just express my opinions and think through things and talk about things. And, this is how we connect as human beings. And I think something about that experience sort of made me walk into the world without any sort of chip on, whatever microchip people have in their brain that tells them that different opinions mean that you can't actually connect as humans. Yeah. So I've never had any sense of if someone disagreeing with me, now I feel insulted. That's a very foreign concept to me. I feel uncomfortable when people use bad logic to disagree with me, or tell me motives, or, engage in kind of an ad hominem or fallacies. That kind of can get under my skin a lot. But just the mere fact that someone thinks, I'm a Catholic, the Catholic Church is maybe complete BS or a cult, something that doesn't create any distance between me and that person. And so in some ways that harmed me, that I felt like I could kind of argue with people easily. And I realized, okay, not everyone wants to argue with Noelle, or not everyone wants to have these discussions or debates that something. And so, I valued a truth-seeking environment, but I also really am a relationally oriented person. And so harming friendships was something that was really kind of made me say, whoa, I need to change my course here. Anyway, so I feel like all those things contributed into a lifelong struggle to sort of understand how to navigate these things, good, healthy, robust, loving relationships and friendships, but also really being a person who seeks the truth and is not afraid to say what she believes is true, and not going to kind of compromise my own beliefs because of the feelings of another person. And so all those things are really fascinating to me. And then one of the things that kind of was an impetus in writing the book. I'd been writing articles for different publications since about 2018 about the woke stuff from various perspectives. And in 2019, I remember hearing that my alma mater, I'd gone to a Christian college, an evangelical college, and they were having a bunch of woke protests on their campus about stained glass window in their chapel. And, I don't want to get into the details of it, but it just occurred to me, what would it be like to be a college student now and growing up in that environment? And I can think back as someone who entered in college, a Christian college, without kind of had left all of my faith. I didn't have any faith at all. And then reverted back to the faith of my origin, which is Catholicism, throughout college or in the midst of college. And what would it have felt now then to have had this sort of kind of environment where you're looking to find how you're marginalized, looking to find out how you might be offended. You're looking to kind of call out people. And I think it would have really compromised my spiritual formation and also my education. At that time, I needed to be studying. I needed to be learning. I need to be asking questions, and I need to be having a free, open environment to discuss things and not be seeking to find out how I can be aggrieved, and I have ways that I could have been aggrieved. At first, I wasn't a Christian at all. And then I was a Catholic. I'm daughter of an Asian immigrant. That probably is not the first thing people see when they see my face, but it's not that, these things are foreign to me, the concept of oppression or racism and all these things. Anyway, and it was really through thinking through what are we doing to kids now, particularly on the campus. But now the campus is kind of everywhere, right? That's the thing with the woke movement, is that it's spread to being in the boardroom and in your neighborhood barbecue and at the block party and in your friendships and in your families. And I think that, that's a microcosm, but there was one kind of experience that kind of really made me motivated to do more than just write articles. And I'd been writing books with a co-author called Theology of Home. We have 3 of them in a series. So I reached out to my editor one evening and said, hey, what if I wrote a book about the woke movement? And I gave him the title and the premise. And the next day we had a contract. And then I think it was 3 weeks into writing it. And then COVID quarantine hit. My kids all came home from school. I was homeschooling all of a sudden. And then the riots hit. It was a really bizarre experience. And I think it lent a sense of urgency to the project, just to see all these ideas kind of playing out in the streets.
Do you have a Christian publisher?
Yeah, it's Tan Books.
Okay, because I think there's an element there of, were you hesitant to bring it up? I have been talking about this on my social media accounts and stuff like that. And there's been, the reason I'm able to do is I'm just in a unique, in a religious school now. If I was still in public school, I would have gotten fired. I'm certain of that, because I've gotten letters sent to the school that I'm a racist, sexist, homophobe for essentially just asking questions to people publicly. And were you worried about that? Were you concerned about getting canceled, getting whatever it is?
No, I mean, maybe in some ways it's easy for me not to be worried about that, because I'm not, I guess I have some eyes on me, but it's not at anything compared to someone who is maybe, has a lead role in a college or university setting, or, has more of the public eye. But I think that I kind of am compelled by the idea that the consequences of not speaking out about something that I feel strongly about are far greater to me than the consequences that may come from speaking out. And so I kind of weighed those at one point when someone said that to me, are you nervous to speak out on such a controversial issue? And I just thought, I think I'm more afraid of not doing it when I feel compelled to, and that I feel I have an ability to. So it's not, and the strangers, I've gotten hate mail and hateful comments and stuff like that. And it's, sometimes it's a little bit like, oh, you really misunderstood me, or, and it feels kind of like there's a lot of anger coming at you from people who don't know you. And that feels unsettling, but it's easy for me to brush that off. I think the harder thing for me has been that it's created a little bit of strain in surprising places with dear friends that I feel like I've fostered lifelong friendships with people who we think very differently. And we've always felt kind of a pride in that, right? That we believe so different, but we love each other so much. And I think there's been a new strain there since I've been more public, but I think we've worked hard to kind of, agree to still love each other through that. But that feels to me far more challenging than a stranger, someone who knows me kind of, all of a sudden that can give me pause. Like, I don't want to alienate you, but I also don't want to feel like I have control over the reactions that people are going to take from my speaking out, right? So
Yeah.
I can't control the effect. I can only control how I do it. And I feel like I really try to do it out of love, purely, and not out of through ridicule or anything like that. Although that can be tempting sometimes. There's lots of ridicule.
It is. No, it really is. I had a conversation, Instagram Live, go kind of viral with 3 critical race theory educators. And they were pretty brutal to me. And I just really tried to maintain my Socratic method, asking questions, never doing personal attacks, always looking for common ground. And I think that once people started to view it and it kind of spread out, people overwhelmingly, even who would have sided with them, recognized that they were in the wrong, even if they agreed with them, because of the way that you approach. Because you don't want to take that like, you know, it's so easy too to like go for a personal attack or something like that, and trying to avoid that.
Yeah.
So just breaking down your book, there's so much in it. I guess the beginning of it, it goes to the origin. So this is stuff that you might find also in like cynical theories, you know, James and
Yeah.
Helen Pluckrose's book and stuff like that. You do it in a very concise way. It's actually, I think it's a little bit easier to understand the way you broke it down compared to their book. Maybe, and I don't mean this as an insult to you at all, but like talking to James Lindsay, I've had conversation. It's so up here. I'm like, what are you talking about? He's so smart, you know? And I think you make it easier to digest, which I think is really good. But for the listeners, can you give us like a real brief synopsis of what that is? Like, what are the origins of this critical social justice kind of stuff? Like, what would you have like a quick version of that?
Version of that. Yeah. I mean, I think I would distill it down to 3 main influences: neo-Marxism, neo-Freudianism, and postmodernism. So the neo-Marxism is heavily influenced by Hegel, and I'm sure you probably talked about that with James Lindsay. He's actually great. He explains Hegel really well, and I think Hegel is very difficult to understand. But that gives it that kind of movement through his conflict theory, and then this progression to a perfect end, and it eliminates a sort of limiting principle, right? Like you want to be the last, you don't want to be the last person to the full flowering of the revolution. And so, you know, I think that kind of explains the nature of progressivism, which is, you know, you keep pushing the envelope more and more and more until the envelope is disseminated. But so you know, the neo-Marxism kind of aligns with the 3 dogmas in my book. The neo-Marxism gives rise to sort of, this is an oversimplification, but to a collectivist mindset, you know, that we are totems, an avatar representing a group. The neo-Freudianism gives rise to that expressive individualism, the second dogma, that our will is more important than our destabilized nature and reason. And then the postmodernism aligns somewhat with the rejection of authority and the reduction of everything into elements of power. Yeah. So that's not really a historical genealogy, but I feel like you probably talked about that a ton on your podcast. I don't want to belabor.
No, I think it's just really useful. I teach high school, so I got just breaking things down. What's that like Einstein quote? Make things as simple as possible, but not simpler or something. I think just like the basics of it. And look, like the way that you explain this too is like this is what the design was, and look at where we're at now. I mean, I had Karu Wang on it 2 years ago who was talking about China and like the big plan of China to basically take down the West. And it's like, this is our plan. We're going to do this, and then you look at what's happening and you go, like, maybe it's coincidence, but regardless, the plan was this, and then it's this. You look at like mass incarceration of like the African-American population of America. John Ehrlichman, the advisor to Nixon, who was, you know, spearheading the war on drugs, was like, this was a way for us to mass incarcerate Black people and hippies and stuff like that. And then it was implemented, and then that's what happened. So even if this is just like a coincidence, I think just recognizing that there were these individuals put in very powerful institutions like education colleges and stuff like that, that had this plan, these are their ideas. And then you look at everything going on right now, there is a direct thread there that I think should at least be recognized, you know?
That's right. No, I think it's right. And I mean, you're spot on that when you talk about it, people can think you sound really conspiratorial, but it's an open secret. You know, just read what they're saying. This is the implication of what they're saying. This is the plan. So, you know, maybe but people conspire, and you know they. And I think that was one of the interesting things about writing the book, is that I began thinking of it as kind of a social political movement. And then somewhere fairly early on through researching, I just started realizing, oh my gosh, this is a brilliant like
It
spiritual
is.
battle, you know.
Which is
And
weird, right? Because it's so dumb almost. Like the ideas are very dumb, but the way that they go about it is so brilliant.
yeah, and the well, they're dumb, but they're dumb because they're so contrary to kind of reason and nature,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And so they're kind of absurd. There's an absurdity there. But they um
Yeah,
the, the devil is absurd. You know, the lies are going to be absurd, and lies are going to get more and more brazen. But this movement, I think, really kind of systematically like institutionalizes this whole host of lies that actually come together to utterly destabilize ourselves on a personal level, familial level, institutional level, as countrymen, you know, as communities. It really creates a lot of seeds, a lot of chaos through that system.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, James is great, and he's helped me a lot to understand this stuff, but he is also an atheist, and he also does things that I don't like his approach. And I've told him this openly, like we're friendly, like, but he takes cheap shots. He goes after people. He, plays that kind of digging game to embarrass people and stuff like that because he gets attacked all the time. And I think that that's just not the approach that I want to take. It's not the approach that I believe in. And I think that taking a more religious, more Christian specifically approach that you're taking, I think that it opens up some important things. You mentioned the concept, this is a very well-known concept, but of hate the sin, not the sinner. And that is something that you talk about in the book. And what would you say that looks like, as far as like for those who are out there in these anti-woke circles that I kind of find myself in, what would that look like to you in like your analysis of like this concept of hate the sin, not the sinner?
Yeah, no, I think I talked in the book that there's been a shift from abandon, hate the sin, love the sinner to love the sin, hate the sinner. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I said at first I thought, wait, did I say that right?
Yep.
So the idea is that, you know, it almost sounds like an old Christian trope, love the sinner, hate the sin. And I think that was kind of used in kind of the movement towards tolerance, and in some ways through people of goodwill who are really concerned that Christians were too strident, were not truly seeing the dignity of another person. That's why it's so confusing, or not confusing, but that's why it's so powerful. It's because there's always truth there, right? That Christians needed to be more loving in their approach to human beings and people who, you know, were struggling with certain sins or what have you. But somewhere in that process, there became this message that in order to love people, you have to compromise on principle, right? So that you have to, insofar as you can no longer love the sinner if you still hate the sin, right? That somehow is the identity of the actual sinner. That person
Yeah.
has become their sin. And so in hating the sin, you're still, or in rejecting the sin, or still calling it a sin, you're somehow hating them. So it was I think, you know, in the grand master plan, you know, if there is one, not by an individual in particular, but I think just the motion of sin in the world. I think that the tolerance movement became a Trojan horse to kind of say something that is ostensibly true, that we need to be more compassionate, more loving, but to encourage us to abandon the idea of truth itself, and that the proclamation of sin is something that we no longer can say. And that in saying it, we become people who are no longer, you know, doing our greatest mission, which is to love human beings. And the irony, I think, is that what that ushered in was the opposite problem, which is a far greater problem, which is that, you know, human beings still want to understand what it means to be virtuous, what it means to be good, what it means to fall short. And we just impose those categories in the opposite way. So now, to quote a cardinal, deceased Cardinal George, he would say, we're a society that permits everything and forgives nothing. The idea being that it's a merciless replacement, that we, in eliminating the idea that there's an objective norm of behavior, we've shifted that judgment, if you will, onto the human heart. So I don't know whether your actions are right or wrong, because I'm no longer able to say that, but I'm going to have to kind of discern who you are and what your motives are. You know, that's the way we talk about morality now. And you could think about it in a whole host of ways. So for example, like with a transgender movement, if we're, bringing boys into girls' locker rooms, or, female identifying boys.
Mm.
Now we have to discern, say, okay, if I'm a parent who's worried about my daughter, she's 14 and she's in a locker room, I no longer can say that someone who has the male anatomy can no longer be in that locker room. I have to say that he can, right? Because I've lost that sort of objective sense of standard of what is permissible or not. So now I have to like kind of read his heart. Like, are you a predator, or are you truly identifying this way? I don't know how to do that. But I think that happens in a whole host of ways when we relinquish that ability to kind of just say that an act is wrong, right? We start having to say that the person is wrong. And I think we see that a lot with with the woke movement in general. Reading the hearts of the human person.
Yeah, you mentioned something about we've gotten rid of, you said there's zero objective measure in society now. And you don't have the objective measure, then what you get is like Douglas Murray's books, which are great, and they're hilarious, because almost the entire, especially Madness of Crowds, is just constant hypocrisy. It's you talk about it in your book as well. Like it's okay to do this, but not this. It's okay for me to attack you, but not for you to attack me. Like, I mean, during those riots and protests and stuff like that, I saw a video of a white man, like who looked like me. I'm just gonna assume white cis man or whatever I get labeled as. Okay, throwing a water bottle at a black woman holding her black child because she had like a MAGA hat or something equivalent on, and he had a Black Lives Matter shirt. It's like it was a very strange visual. But what happens is, when you get rid of those objective measures, then you can just kind of apply it any way you want. I think about that as far as a moral guide as well, Noelle. It's like, if we don't have a moral guide, then who's to decide what moral is? So you go after the very easy, low-hanging fruit. Racism is bad. Picking on marginalized people is bad. And the people who got rid of any kind of moral guides, say like religious text, go to, well, I know this is obviously bad, so I'm going to go after this one. Does that ring true to you? Kind of like my line of thinking. What are your thoughts on
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I think that it starts to, this is one of my biggest issues with the movement. It starts to make us doubt our own ability to think, right? Because I think the problem is that the human mind, our minds want to hang our hats on certain principles, right? Like we want to see sort of how we operate in the world, how an idea plays itself out, and we want to see it play itself out justly. And once we abandon that sense of justice as a principle, because we necessarily, through identity politics, have to say there are things that are okay for one group that are not okay for another group, well, we've abandoned principle altogether. And I think that compromises our own ability to trust our instincts of what is fair and what is right, what is true. And I think that's part of the movement that benefits the ideology itself, is that insofar as you can intimidate people into thinking that they can think with through like universal principles that unite human beings rather than dividing them into groups, if they can no longer trust their own desire and intellectual desire to do that, they can no longer trust their own ability to think in general, I think. And so that behooves a totalitarian system, right? Like if you want to kind of make people malleable and docile to your power structure that you want to implement, then you have to get them to be afraid and wary of making a misstep, and to not trust their own ability to reason or to judge situations.
Yeah, you go into a little bit, I mean, along those lines of like totalitarian things, of like difference between authority and authoritarian. Can you explain like your take on that? Because I thought that was really, really powerful in trying to understand like the authoritarian kind of measures of a lot of people who are woke and the way that they have come after wielding power and stuff. Compare that to authority, especially in the context of this lens of like authority being from, God, from God's authority, essentially.
Yeah, no, so authority, I think at its root, the word authority springs from an origin, right? Like it implies some sort of generative quality, and it also implies fatherhood. So I think I talk a lot about fatherhood in that chapter in particular. And I think that that's connected, right? Like that's why every revolutionary from to Marcuse knew they had to target the father, either undermine his moral authority by ridiculing him or by undermining his moral authority in actuality, right? And so like Engels would write about how every man needs to be sexually licentious, because that was a way to, from the inside out, undermine society and the structure of society. Because once a man is no longer has self-mastery, then a woman becomes cynical, distrustful, because she's made to be in some ways protected. She's physically more vulnerable. She bears children in her bodies and then in her body, and then also cares for them with her body, even when they after birth. And children makes children rebellious, because the people who are most beholden or most given a mission to shepherd them are compromised in their own ability to lead through virtue. So I think it's really effective to target fathers. But I think that in targeting fathers, we're targeting the concept of authority itself. And I think the movement does this in several ways, not just through fatherhood, but also through the smashing of statues, right? Like the idea of throwing paint on a statue or removing a statue, it's not really so much about that statue or that person. It's the idea of trying to eliminate the idea of history or heroism or authority, that there's an authority there that somebody might have imbued. And so if you can kind of find a way that person who was someone who united us in the past is now someone who we have to utterly disdain and denounce, you're denouncing our ability to have some sort of kind of uniting narrative, but also some sort of something to aspire to. You see that in patriotism too. Patria, even the word patria, that has there's a father, there's something fatherly about that, the etymology. So I think that the idea is that if you can separate authority from an objective good, because authority implies reverence, right? So anyone who is given authority, they're commissioned from something above them, like they're given an officer is given a commission from above, or if you're an author, supposedly you have a higher commission because you've done this research, but it's a signpost to something higher. And so there's a great Bishop Sheen quote. I can't remember if it's in the book or not, but he says, to paraphrase, "Beware of anyone who tries to claim authority who has not learned to obey." And I love that quote because it implies that sort of generative piece, and that we're connected to our history, we're connected to our fathers, we're connected through a lineage, and that implies reverence ultimately and first and foremost to God. And I think that the attack on fatherhood and all of these other things are really just a way to attack the concept of authority itself, which is God, who is the author and authority of all of us. Yeah. And he's not a father because he's not a father because he's like human fathers. Like, he's the primary analogous. Human fathers are more fatherly the more that they're like him. So in attacking the father, you really attack God the Father. So the thing that's ironic about it is that the people who are most the question authority generation, like the hippies, questioning authority, become almost like sort of the first ones to become compliant, right? Because once you lose an objective standard, an objective principle, you're sort of at the mercy of the whims of the strong man. You don't have any leg to stand on any longer. You've cut the branch off on which you're sitting. And conversely, the people who are the most able to kind of stand up against an authoritarian government tend to be the people who have a grounding in some objective principle.
Martin Luther King. Yeah.
What's that?
Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
I mean, I love the way you break down the etymology of words, Noelle, because we change definitions so quickly now. Like definitions are just changing. So to go down to like, well, it's almost like a Chesterton Spence argument of like, what was the establishment of this original definition and why? One of the ones that stuck out that I didn't know, I love looking at like, where did the word like sin come from, to miss the mark and stuff like that. But you talked about the devil and Diablo as like basically to throw apart. It's like to divide, to throw apart is what it means, something along those lines. And my thing is always unity. I love Daryl Davis. I've had him on the show twice. Are you familiar with Daryl Davis?
I don't think so.
Oh my gosh, what an awesome guy. He was he's a black guy, he's a jazz musician, and he sat down and found out the guy he was sitting down for a beer with was a member of the KKK, and he befriended him. And then he befriended several members of the KKK, went to Klan rallies, and then over the course of having a real friendship with them, they gave up their robes. They said, I don't want this lifestyle anymore. And he got like 300 people to leave neo-Nazi groups in the KKK by befriending them. It's incredible. He is like a real like unity guy. And I am all about unity too. I'm like, how do I whenever I see someone who I really disagree with, I invite them on the show. They typically don't come on, but I am really interested in finding common ground with people. So people are like, why are you doing that? It's like, well, it's a good question. Why do I like unity so much? But then when you go into the history of the devil, evil is to throw apart, it's to divide. That really stuck with me. That's like a really interesting thing, because so much is about division within this woke culture. So when people say it's demonic or it's evil, it's like, maybe it's by definition demonic or evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the three dogmas in the book, the first one induces people to become like to find their moral status in being victims, right? And I think that's one of the problems of the first dogma. But what does it mean to be a perpetual victim? You have to have a perpetual perpetrator. You have to find someone to accuse. We become an accuser. That's one of the characteristics of the devil. That's what I think Satan means, the accuser. The second one is the will over reason. We define ourselves by our sin. And I think we know, in the Christianity teaches that God calls us by our name, not by our sin. The devil calls us by our sin, not by our name. And the third one is the non-servium, power over authority. It's a refusal to reverence, a refusal to serve. And that's how Lucifer fell. It's the non-servium. I will not serve. And that the call and leadership of the Christian is to serve. That is the essential call. So it's interesting when and I don't know if I put that in the book. I kind of figured it out afterwards that there was that 3 levels of identity. But it's interesting how much identity is being talked about now, and to put together what is this saying? Who is this calling us? Who are we identified as in this movement? And I think it lines up really with a diabolical definition.
Yeah. Identity is such an interesting thing. I talk about it a lot because I've had all these different people on that identify in different ways. But when I've had people on who are like, they identify as a trans activist compared to a trans person who identifies as a computer programmer, what they focus on and how they get offended and stuff is very, very different. You know, I talk about faith. I've done podcasts on faith as well, and I've been on my own faith journey that people following along are kind of witnessing. I just got baptized like 4 days ago, which was a big decision of mine, even to go public with it. But those concepts, and it's in like biblical scripture too, of if you look for me being God, you will find me. But you have to look. And I talked to Billy Calderwood on this about Christianity on this podcast, and he's like, we were talking about, like, if you just drop a contact lens on the floor of some, big building, you're not going to find it if you're not looking. But if you say, hey, everyone, look for a contact lens, you might find the contact lens. You are going to find the things that you look for. And by definition, critical race theory, I argue for critical race theory sometimes because there are ways that laws could be racist and you don't see it. So you have to look for it. But it's one of many lenses you should use. But the whole woke movement is to constantly look for the pervasive evil in society. You're constantly seeking out badness and evil. You will find it. You're going to find it. And if you want to constantly seek good, God, good, then you will find that. If you want to constantly seek evil, devil, whatever, then you will find that. And that's, people are choosing to seek out evil and the badness in the world. And then they're just inundated with surrounding themselves with evil, as Kimmy Katiti, shared when she was on the show. Like, makes you feel terrible all the time. And you're choosing to look for this stuff. It's so obvious. It's so obvious to me that you need to get some sort of balance. You can't just always be looking for the negative in everything, how to tear down everything. It's just going to corrupt your mind in terrible ways. It seems so obvious to me.
Yeah, no, I think so. But I think that that's the point, right? That critical theories really to kind of, raising the consciousness of people is the sort of evangelical mission of critical theories, to alert people to the oppression in the misery of their lives. I talk about it, flows from a separate opposite definition, the human person. Are we defined in relationship to love himself as children, sons and daughters of a loving God? And that gives us an evangelical mission to go out and spread the good news to other people, that they are loved and they are important, they're valuable. Or are we defined by the oppression of society, by the hatred of mankind? And that gives us an opposite evangelical mission to go out, or kind of contra evangelical mission to go out and spread to people the bad news, that raise their consciousness, the misery of their lives. But the ideology mimics so much of Christianity in that way. Even just giving it that praxis, praxis is sort of their version of that evangelical call, that gospel mission to raise people's consciousness to what is central to their lives, either love or hate. But what you define yourself as, and I think about this, even people know this on intuitive level. I think this is what kind of, to get back to your point, is that, when you're married to someone, if you spend your day, like, maybe they have good things, they have faults, you spend your time trying to find their faults and be like, oh, wow, there it is. There's that fault. There it is. I'm going to point that out to you. Like how I'll count minutes until that person wants to head for the divorce attorney. Like, give me a break. This is not the way to conduct a friendship. It's not the way to conduct a marriage. It's not the way to conduct yourself with your children.
And it's divisive. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the utterly poison. It's utter poison.
So I agree. So is this a time, you as a woman of faith, I'm sure to some degree you believe that if more people had faith in God, Christianity, etc., that things would be better. I mean, I believe that. I don't know, but I believe that. Is the time kind of getting ripe for some sort of new revival? I think that when I hear Jonathan Haidt, who's an admitted atheist, say that we have a container in ourselves for a belief in a higher power, for things like that, that is being, and now there's a God-shaped hole in us, essentially. Nietzsche, we, killed God, and what's going to fill that, void in all of us. And now this woke stuff seems to be, I mean, the fact that Colin Wright, who had the show, who was like part of the new atheist movement, very anti-woke stuff, he said, this came out of these atheists who abandoned their God and then are looking for something to fill that gap, and wokeness just fit in really perfectly. And that's kind of what the point of your book is. Is this like the time perfect for people to go, wait a second, yeah, we do need something to fill that gap. So I have all these options for something to fill this religion-sized hole. Maybe I'll turn to a religion that's all about love and acceptance and all the beautiful elements of Christianity. I mean, do you see this as a time where Christianity can have some sort of revival in mainstream society? Because I do, and at least I'm hopeful of that.
Yeah, no, I think so. I very much so. I mean, it's one of the ways that the movement, I think, has been so powerful is that I'll say it, not they, because there are many people in the movement who are really animated by, I think, what they think is good. So I don't want to cast too broad of a net, but I think the way the movement operates is that it's really good at manipulating people's wounds. And people have understandable wounds. We've dismantled so many stabilizing intermediary or mediating institutions in society that people are left sort of bereft and unmoored. And I analogize it to kind of like, if you don't have, you're looking to belong, deep human needs, belonging, you want to feel loved, you want to feel significant, you want to feel known. Well, a tribalism and ideology gives you a sense of belonging, gives you like-minded people. You want to feel some sense of loyalty. Well, you'll get that there. You want to feel significant or unique. You can get that from becoming a marginalized gender identity, and I'm not saying that's what animates every person who identifies differently. I'm just saying that we've given young people who are deeply hurt and wounded and want to feel important place to where they can feel that, you change. And I've heard transgender people talk about this. Like, I was 16, I was confused. And I just realized, like, if I got so celebrated when I changed my pronouns, and what's the next step? There's a social contagion there that I think is undeniable. So whether I do think that your question is a good one. I want to think about it more, but with it, there's so many, as you say, James Lindsay and, all these atheists who have been really great forces, I think, in fighting all of this. And, and I think that should be, we should have a big tent in that way. And obviously, like, if, a lot of times people like that who have goodwill, and we're seeing this, I think, who knows, but with Jordan Peterson, I know he keeps those things private, but obviously he's, there's a way in which the truth is compelling to you and you can come at it from all sorts of different angles, but it's because it's not an ideology, right? And the truth is trying to be docile to the fullness of everything that's real: scientific reality, philosophical principles, metaphors, myths, all these things kind of all point towards something that is the truth. And so I think there's a lot of freedom there. And the way that people will embrace things is by coming at it in their own time and in their own way, and through their own depth of thought and their own freedom. And the thing you embrace more deep, like through your own freedom, is the thing you'll embrace more enduringly. And I loved what you were saying earlier, I think before we started the interview, that you try to encounter like all the obstacles and all the doubts and all the arguments against, because I think that sets you up to sort of have a depth of freedom and security and, confidence in what you've ultimately arrived at, which, is, I think, what you believe found to be true.
Yeah. And you know it. I mean, if you don't allow yourself to go up against any kind of resistance, I tell my like more liberal friends, like, you should be listening to Ben Shapiro a lot, because even you can disagree with him. I disagree with him on several things, but he's smart and he makes good points. Like, what the problem is on this podcast, the people that come on generally agree with me. And I don't want that. I would love to have a conversation with Ibram Kendi. I would be very kind to him, but I would ask him questions. And the people that came on that I was just asking very simple questions, they get very, very angry because, as you said, they don't know how to think through these things. It's so like very basic questions they don't know because they've had no resistance, because any kind of resistance just gets shouted down and yelled at and canceled and stuff like that, or you get called one of the isms or a bigot or whatever it is. So there's just no resistance. And I challenge everything, even including, my faith. That was how I arrived at it, was constant Sam Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins and the debates and their books and Lindsay Bogosian, all these people who I love, like, but I was just like, that didn't work for me. And I kept going up against that. And so part of this what I'd like to do on the podcast is the steel man arguments, as opposed to a straw man where you hold up the worst arguments for your detractors. Your book is a Christian response to this, this cult of wokeness. And John McWhorter says it's a religion. John Haidt, these people all agree with you that takes the same framework as a religion. These social scientists. But what's the best argument you can make to that wokeness, to keep using this pejorative term, but we all know what it means, is not opposed to Christianity? What do you think are the best arguments to say that Christianity and this woke doctrine can actually flow together the way that, as you point out in the book, many churches are leaning into it and things like that? How would you try to defend that position?
I think the best and probably only defense would have to separate it from the principles that I outlined in the book. Like, it would have to be a defense that says, this is not an effort to this is not a fundamentally atheistic effort, which I think it is, but it would have to deny
separate
that
from the founders.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that so I know world Christians. So I think that their best argument would be, we have not, you don't truly know what it is to walk in the shoes of someone who has lived a really marginalized life. You don't know what it feels like to be on urban city street and to be stopped for something you didn't do and to be questioned, and that's just because of your appearance or your skin color. We have not fully reckoned with our history of redlining and multiple ways in which we've institutionalized sort of a sense of racism that has actually contributed to generational harms that we are culpable of because we've inversely had benefits from them. So I think it would be something along those lines. And then for, sexual sins, I think it would be more along the lines of, it would be sort of personal narratives, I think tend to be the most compelling. Like, my dear friend is a teacher in a Christian school, and he's a homosexual and he's living with a man. And, who are we to kind of tell him that he's not a positive influence on these students when I see him being a positive influence every day? Like, why are we taking a hard stance? Why should a Christian school have any sort of, delineation that would prevent him and preclude him from being an influence in students' lives? So I think it would be a combination of those types of things, that we're just trying to reckon with a history that has been harmful and has had ramifications in the modern day society for people who are in oppressed groups, and also a narrative of, there are good-willed people who are suffering and struggling, and they are a brother or sister to all of us.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah, like the idea that you'd have to separate it from the intentions of the founders of these ideas. were pernicious in their arguments, but maybe it's evolved into something that's different and more aligned with Christianity and more aligned with goodness than they intended. I think it's a stretch, but yeah, I think that's probably the best argument that you can make to try and connect them. So where can people keep up with your work, get the book and everything like that? Because I think it works even for people who aren't Christian. I think to understand, you know, pinning one kind of moral code against another kind of, I talk about my like faith as like an OS, like an operating system. And I think wokeness is an operating system. You kind of see everything through that lens. Like I try to see everything through the lens of some sort of like, you know, God created world, as opposed to see the lens through the woke, you know, oppressor oppressed matrix. So I think it works for people even that aren't Christian. But if you are a Christian and you are kind of following along with some of this critical social justice stuff, I think it's a quick read, and I think it's excellent at kind of getting you to spark some thought of like, oh yeah, maybe that's why it makes me feel a little weird inside or something like that. Where can people follow your work? Oh, it's excellent.
Well, thank you. So I have my own website where I put all my articles whenever I publish. It's just my name, noellemering.com. I'm also editor for theologyofhome.com. We have a blog and a daily email that you can subscribe to for free there, and a shop, and we have 3 books we've published through that name. But the books are also sold on wherever you buy books. And I really tried to develop it on that level where I think it can be compelling. I hope it is compelling to someone who is not only not Catholic, but not Christian at all. And that the thrust, I think, of the argument is that this is actually a movement of despair that's telling people that their lives, they don't have any agency, they don't have any way to change and improve their lives, and their bodies are meaningless, which means that they are meaningless. So I think that any person who picks it up should be able to find something that is compelling, regardless of whether or not they're a person of any particular faith lineage.
Yeah, thank you. You did a great job of taking these. This is kind of unnecessarily complex by design. So people just go, I don't know, so I'm just going to believe the platitude versions of this. You take this really complex stuff and you break it down in a very simple way. So that I really appreciate the way that you write, because I think it makes it easier for more people to digest who aren't, you know, James Lindsay type people.
Good. Yeah. No, I mean, I was speaking to myself because I'm not a, you know, I've not spent 30 years in academia. I've been raising babies.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. Sorry for the technical issues, but
No problem.
thank you for people for listening, and please check out the book. It's rare that I would come on and like be so obsequious about a book, but I thought it was really, really well done. So I'm glad I got to talk to you about it and share it with people.
Thanks so much. It was fun chatting with you.